This presentation will take a look at two poems, Tissue by Imtiaz Dharker and Ozymandias by Percy Shelley, and then bring them together in a comparison of the two poems, and I'll try and compare ideas as we go through as well. Start with the key themes now. Some of these themes are more appropriate to one poem than the other, but actually I think in my mind these two poems are the strongest comparison in the whole of the Power and Conflict anthology, and all four of these themes can quite easily be applied to both poems: the fallibility of humans and human power, the danger of excessive pride, and particularly the way we try and cement or represent our pride or our power. Leading on from that, the misplaced or misused notions of power. Our understanding of power is a little bit off according to these two poems. And then the enduring power of nature and time, which is always there to remind us of our own fallibility and mortality. Dharker, in her poem Tissue, one of the questions the poem asks is, what is it that defines our success or our power or our status? And I have here a number of images. Is it material things, or is it the things that we do? Is it our family? Is it what we stand for? Is it the job that we do, the difference that we make? What is it that defines us? And Dharker asks us to consider whether we're defining ourselves and our status and our power and our level of success in the wrong things, whether trying to define that through material objects is sustainable. We also get a look at the notion of paper in this poem, and we are asked to consider as well, what do we feel is the importance of paper, and what are the documents and what are the bits of paper that define us most clearly? Is it our passport, our birth certificate, or is it a photo album, for example? These are just random objects, they don't necessarily belong to the poem. But which of these is most important in defining us? Again, is it about an identity which either is enforced upon us, or is our identity defined by the things that we do and the memories that we share? Now, this is a poem called Tissue, but the extended metaphor in the poem is of paper, and it's an appropriate extended metaphor. First of all, paper could be considered a symbol of fragility. It is easily lost or destroyed. It can be destroyed. It is not concrete. Documents are a version of history rather than what actually happened. But it could also be considered a symbol of power. It is a blank canvas upon which we can write. It facilitates the objects of identity, which gives power to others to control us. It might have national or historical importance. It's used for making rules and laws. It documents our lives and solidifies memories. So paper is an appropriate metaphor because it contains notions of both fragility and power. So why call it tissue then if paper is the metaphor? Well, tissue shares many qualities with paper, but it also shares qualities with human beings. It is fragile, it is transparent, and that is what Dharker is asking us to be, really. But at the same time, it has healing quality, tissue rather than paper, that is. And certainly, and this is probably the most important one, tissue is also human flesh. So she's using the metaphor of paper or tissue as a representative item for human beings, and it seems to me to be an entirely appropriate one. The other thing the poem does is to ask us to consider the contrast and the difference between paper and concrete, or certainly things made of seemingly more stable material. And I ask my students this. Most of the ideas in this presentation are from my brilliant Year 11 class. why do you think such structures are built? And we've got a number on the right here. Christ the Redeemer, Nelson's Column, the Queen Victoria statue, the Shard, the Great Wall of China, the Taj Mahal, and the Burj Khalifa. And some of the ideas they came up with were to reveal wealth as a statement of the power of religion, as a commemorative idea. Displays of power, certainly, to preserve history and to preserve moments of power within history. Some of them are acts of remembrance. They might also act as protection. And Dharker asks us to consider, why do we do this in this poem? And she says here, these are her own words, Bombay, where I live, is a city of grandiose dreams and structures held together with sellotape and string. And she seems to be saying here, these displays of power that we make through material objects, and particularly through buildings, are in themselves fragile, because it's what they stand for that's important. It's the ideas behind them. And if those ideas are incorrect or weak, then it doesn't matter how many statues or structures you build. Time will eventually find them out. The truth will shine through them, and they will cease to have the meaning that they were designed to have. So she asks us to question, really, why we do this, what are we doing it for? And those ideas on the previous slide are important. She questions whether our desire to celebrate moments of power and pride in order to maintain them is really a healthy thing, because it's just masking problems that lie behind them. So let's get into the poem, and Dharker opens with these two stanzas. Paper that lets the light shine through, this is what could alter things. Paper thinned by age or touching, the kind you find in well-used books, the back of the Quran where a hand has written in the names and histories, who was born to whom. And the first idea I want to pick up on here is that for Dharker, it isn't just paper which could alter things, but paper which lets the light shine through. And light seems to be, in this poem, particularly sunlight, first of all a symbol for truth, but also a symbol for the power of nature and time. It is something that is enduring. And I think what she's saying here is that paper that lets the light shine through, paper which shows the truth, which is transparent, which isn't trying to hide something, which acknowledges its own fragility, is what could alter things. And if that is the metaphor for human beings, then she's saying the same thing about us. We would be much more powerful if we acknowledged our own mortality and our own fragility. We would be much more powerful if we allowed the truth to shine through, if we were transparent. The end stop at the end of that statement seems to clarify that for Dharker, this is a statement of truth. This is not something that is open to debate. And then she draws on this idea of the kind you find in well-used books, the back of the Quran, where a hand has written in the names and histories, who was born to whom. The hand is important here. It's important that it is a personalised history. It is not a glorified version of history, which is what these statues and buildings seem to represent. The personal histories are much more powerful and much more important. And she also draws the distinction between just names, but it's important that it is names and histories. We are defined by what we do, not just an image that we present to the world. In stanzas 3 and 4, she develops the idea, the height and weight, who died where and how, on which sepia date, pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent with attention. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. We notice the enjambment from line 4 to the end of stanza 3, which perhaps represents the relentlessness of time. We are fallible, and time will continue beyond us. There's no rhyme scheme, but there is an internal rhyme in these two stanzas, wait and date and drift and shift within the line. And somebody suggested in my class this is perhaps a criticism of society's need for concrete examples of power. Dharker suggesting perhaps that they don't work. The internal rhyme reveals that these ideals can be subtly demonstrated instead of demonstrating them in concrete form, and that would be a much more powerful statement. But also perhaps that there is a hidden structure to society, and it is therefore wrong of us to impose structure on society by our displays of power, which I thought was a lovely idea. You'll notice in these two stanzas, and as the poem develops, the increasing use of assonance, which gives the poem a softness. And there was a suggestion that this softness is representative of the softness of human identity and humanity, which contrasts with the harshness of the facade that society displays in the form of buildings and monuments. It is the tenderness we display to others that defines us, not what is written about us or what we build or what we construct, but our humanity that defines us. And she suggests if buildings were paper. And I think this is part of Dharker's point in the poem, to accept the fragility of things, to accept the malleability of things. Things can be shaped and can be changed, and we shouldn't try to solidify them in moments in time. And then she talks about the sepia date. Paper is archaic, yes, but it is reliable and it endures. And what is written on those pieces of paper will endure long beyond the buildings and the concrete that we erect to try and remember those moments of power in time. On to stanzas 5 and 6 then. She says, maps too, the sun shines through their borderlines, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds, fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. Light and the sun, as I've mentioned already, is a motif in the poem, and it seems to be symbolic not only of the truth but also of nature and time. It has enduring power, and here it is able to shine through the border lines on maps, those lines that humanity has drawn in order to create divisions of power. Well, the truth, the light, time and nature will shine through that and reveal it for what it is. And then we get a mixture of the man-made and the natural here. And this seems to be critical of humanity's need to cement things, critical of our attempt to commercialise the beauty of the natural world. The way in which we're trying to elevate ourselves in concrete man-made objects is overtaking the beauty of the natural world. But ultimately it is the beauty of the natural world which will endure. So our attempts to impose ourselves are ultimately futile. And then we move on to one of the most important lines in the poem. What was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. Here, Dharker is clearly critical of the way in which we allow money to control our lives. Money is the manipulator here. We are the kite in this simile. And so it is able to manipulate us and control us. But let's not forget that kites are also manipulated by the wind and by nature. So once again, she is flagging up nature's power in this poem, which belittles our own significance. And it seems that money is a thing that we have created in order to establish power and solidify power. And that creation has ultimately come to control us. So the things that we create in order to measure power ultimately come to define us in a negative way and to ultimately destroy us. On to stanzas 7 and 8 then. An architect could use all this, place layer over layer, luminous script over numbers over line, and never wish to build again with brick or block, but let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths, through the shapes that pride can make, find a way to trace a grand design. The architect here, the grand architect, seems to be seems to be God, and the grand design made of living tissue is mankind. There is an increase in enjambment in these two stanzas, and it seems to portray the ever-increasing relentlessness and destructive quality of time, and it makes us aware of our own mortality. And these two stanzas are very much about accepting our own mortality. Any attempts to cement our power are therefore ultimately futile. Perhaps we should put faith in the idea that the grand architect of God, and we'll see in the next stanza, built a structure never meant to last. We would be much more powerful in our happiness if we accepted our own mortality. It's noticeable that the verbs used in conjunction with the light have changed. It's gone from shining in stanza 1 to breaking through now. Well, if the light represents the truth, represents nature and time, we can see the inevitability of those ideas breaking down our own facades of power. Our power, human power, is therefore temporary. And then we move on to the conclusion, stanzas 9 and 10. With living tissue, build a structure with living tissue, raise a structure never meant to last, and paper smoothed and stroked and thin to be transparent, turned into your skin. And as said previously, it would be much better to accept our own mortality and our own fallibility. We would therefore be much more powerful in our own happiness and contentment. And she finishes with this one-line stanza, which is turned into your skin. So she breaks down the structure, and we have a series of quatrains. We have 9 quatrains, and then the final stanza is just a single line. First of all, turned into your skin seems to create a statement of fact of the correlation between paper and human tissue, in that it is both fragile. But it also displays the fallibility of fabricated structure, I think. It can be broken down, it cannot be taken for granted, just in the same way that we cannot take our own lives and our own power for granted. It will eventually be broken down. Moving on to Ozymandias then, I'll try and draw some comparisons as we go here, and then pull some comparisons together at the end. I want to start with this idea of pride comes before a fall, a really famous quotation. And this is the crux of the poem. This is a poem which acts as a warning against excessive pride. It will only lead to our eventual demise. The title Ozymandias was the name adopted by Ramesses II, a 13th century Egyptian leader, famous for the number of architectural structures he erected in order to leave a legacy of power behind him. Now this is the poem itself, and I'll read it and then we'll pick up various bits of the poem. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions red which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, king of kings, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. We'll start off with the narrative voice. It begins with an unknown third-person narrator, and then we are introduced to a traveller from an antique land who tells most of the rest of the story. We also get the voice not directly, but through description of the sculptor, and his expression comes through the statue. And we also get the voice of Ozymandias on the pedestal, but that is through the eyes of the traveller and the sculptor. So we get Ozymandias, but through the eyes of somebody else, and that's important, because what that does is it distances us from Ozymandias and it belittles him in some way. He doesn't ever get his voice in its entirety. It is always through somebody else. Somebody else is in control of it. The form of this poem is absolutely crucial. It's the sonnet form, 14 lines, written in iambic pentameter. That's 10 syllables per line. And there should always be a regular rhyme in a sonnet. Quite often it's A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. That would be a Shakespearean sonnet. There are some alternatives. Sometimes it's A, A, B, B, C, C, D, D. Sometimes it's A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, and then we go back to the A, B, A, B. There are lots of varieties, but what is always the case is that there is an entirely rigid and regular rhyme scheme. Let's have a look at what Shelley does with the sonnet form. He employs many of the typicalities. There are 14 lines. Most of the poem is written in iambic pentameter, and for part of it there is a regular rhyme. But the rhyme scheme becomes irregular. So Shelley takes it and breaks it down. It goes A, B, A, C, A, D, E, D, F, E, G, H, G, H. So it doesn't have the regularity that you would expect with the sonnet form. The metre also breaks down on line 10. We get an additional syllable on line 10, which is, importantly, is my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. So Shelley takes the form of a sonnet and breaks it down. He takes something seemingly indestructible and deconstructs it. He is making the point here that even the most solid, enduring things can be broken down. They cannot be taken for granted. It's important that I think the rhythm breaks down on the line where Ozymandias declares his ultimate power. This is his expression of power. It's that at that moment of excessive pride that Shelley chooses to break down the rhythm of the poem. That is his warning against excessive pride. We also get an extended metaphor of the statue in this poem, and the statue is a symbol of humanity or of human power. Again, like he does with the sonnet form, he uses the statue to reveal to us that the seemingly indestructible can be destroyed, and in this case they are destroyed by nature and by time, which is very, very similar to the idea that we get in tissue. Those two notions endure long beyond human beings. One of the reasons, it seems, like in tissue, that human power is broken down is because the statue lacks humanity. It is an inanimate object. It's humanity, our human behaviour, which is important in cementing legacy and power, not concrete material possessions. And ultimately, like Dharker does in tissue, Shelley reveals the futility of cementing power in material objects, because over time they will be broken down. Let's have a look at some of the language within the poem now. I'm going to draw a contrast here between the language of power and strength and the language of weakness and destruction. We get words such as vast, stone, king of kings, and mighty, though he's referring to God there. And then we get words in the semantic field of weakness and destruction: trunkless, sunk, shattered, nothing, decay, wreck, bare. Significantly, there are more words associated with weakness and destruction than there are with power and strength, as you can see. And also, quite often, the words that are associated with power are always coupled or accompanied by words of weakness. We get the vast and trunkless legs of stone. We get king of kings, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair, followed by nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. So Shelley always couples words of power, excessive power, with words of destruction. Once again, he's revealing to us that this power cannot be taken for granted, and if we take it for granted, it will be taken from us. This is the opening of the poem then. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown." this notion of the traveller from an antique land, I think, is important because it distances us from Ozymandias. It makes him seem antiquated, outdated, irrelevant, and forgotten. And that's important. It's part of Shelley's desire to belittle Ozymandias throughout this poem. Then we get the description of his two vast and trunkless legs of stone. As I said on the previous slide, the juxtaposition between images of power and images of weakness or destruction is important. But the word choice here of trunkless is particularly important because what Ozymandias is missing, what his statue is missing, is the heart. It is humanity that he lacked. And if we are defined by our humanity, that it goes in some way to explain why Ozymandias, why his power was not enduring. It is half sunk. His head has fallen onto the sand, the shattered visage, half sunk. Already the sand is consuming. Nature is consuming Ozymandias. Nature is taking over. It is nature that endures. And the shattered visage, if our visage, our face, is part of our identity, we can see that Ozymandias is broken here. The identity of power and indestructibility that he tried to build as his legacy is beginning to be broken down. And then it says, and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions red which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. So this is the emotions and the characteristics that the sculptor has captured on this statue of Ozymandias. First of all, he's captured his sneer of cold command, and the plosive alliteration here seems to capture the harshness of Ozymandias' rule and his misuse of power. And then from the sculptor well those passions red which yet survive. It seems to be the sculptor who understands humanity, not Ozymandias himself. He is controlling Ozymandias' identity. And in this case, it is the power of art to endure beyond the power of human beings, further belittling and revealing the futility of trying to cement human power in history. It is the poem that survives, and it is the sculpture which survives, not Ozymandias' legacy. They are, of course, lifeless things. Once again, this is what remains, the lifeless things. There's a misunderstanding of power because humanity is missing from it. It is only the material things that are left. And part of the reason that Ozymandias' power did not last is captured in the line, the heart that fed. Here is a man who gorged on adulation and the adoration of his subject. It is that excessive pride or hubris or misuse of power which caused his downfall. And then we finish with, we get Ozymandias' own words here, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. First of all, ye mighty is important here. The capitalization reveals to us that Ozymandias is talking to God. This is again revealing his excessive pride or hubris. But the fact that he says, look on my works, is also important. It is the material possessions that are crucial to Ozymandias, not his actions, and that is what is missing. But what Shelley does next is very clever. He takes this statement of glorified power that comes from Ozymandias, and then he completely strips that away from him in the very next line. We get nothing beside remains. The juxtaposition is important in highlighting Ozymandias' fall from grace, but also the medial caesura there makes this a statement of finality. Nothing beside remains. That is it. His power, his legacy is gone. Then he says, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So he finishes with the power of nature. We get the plosive consonants of boundless and bare, summing up and capturing nature's power and in its endlessness and its humility. And then we get the assonance and sibilance in the final line, creating this extended feeling of time. So what Shelley finishes with is time and nature's power to endure after human power is gone. And that kind of sums up the overall message of his poem. Let's draw this together then into some sort of comparison, and there are lots of ideas you could compare in this poem. These are only two which relate to the power of human beings. First of all, Dharker asks us to accept the fallibility of human power and to embrace the power of nature and time instead. There's 2 or 3 pieces of evidence there. You could talk about the extended metaphor of tissue. You could also talk about the motif of light there. Very similarly, Shelley exposes the fragility of human power in the face of time and nature. Another 2 pieces of evidence. I always think it's good to have 2 pieces of evidence at least to go with each of your ideas. It will help you develop your analysis. And the subtlety of that comparison is that we need to respect the ability and the power of nature to destroy and to wear us down. We'll be much happier if we do that. The second idea is the futility of cementing human power in material things, and the same idea applies in both poems. And the subtlety of that comparison is perhaps that in both poems the things we create to define our power ultimately come to control us and end up defining our weaknesses. I hope that's been helpful as a look at those 2 poems and drawing them together in a comparison.